The morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Estates as I pulled my black Ford F-150 into the driveway of our newly purchased home. The truck's engine rumbled to a stop, and I sat there for a moment, admiring the pristine suburban landscape that stretched before me. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and houses that looked like they'd been plucked from a magazine. This was exactly what Sarah and I had dreamed of when we decided to leave the chaos of downtown, living behind. Sarah, my wife of 8 years, the love of my life, and as of 6 months ago, a newly minted FBI special agent. She'd been away at Quantico for the past 3 weeks, undergoing specialized training that she couldn't discuss in detail. "Need to know basis, honey?" she'd say, with that mischievous smile that always made my heart skip a beat. "But I promise, you'll be impressed when I get back." I grabbed my toolbox from the truck bed and headed toward the garage. We'd been living in Willowbrook Estates for exactly 2 months, and I was still getting used to the rhythm of suburban life. The Homeowners Association had welcomed us with a thick packet of rules and regulations, presented by a woman named Margaret Thornfield, who spoke with the authority of someone who'd appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial queen. "Now, Mr. Rodriguez," she had said during our first encounter, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she flipped through the HOA handbook. "We maintain very strict standards here in Willowbrook. Property values don't maintain themselves, you understand?" I had nodded politely, skimming through the document that seemed to regulate everything from grass height to mailbox colors. Most of it seemed reasonable enough. No loud music after 10 p.m., keep your lawn maintained, no permanent structures without approval. Standard suburban stuff. What I hadn't paid close attention to was Section 1-B, Vehicle Parking Regulations. 3 days after Sarah left for her training, I received my first notice. It was tucked neatly under my windshield wiper, a crisp white envelope with the Willowbrook Estates logo embossed in gold. Inside was a formal letter on HOA letterhead. "Dear Mr. Rodriguez, it has come to our attention that your vehicle 2019 Ford F-150 license plate, TXF4477, is in violation of Section 1-B of the Willowbrook Estates Community Guidelines. Commercial vehicles, including pickup trucks, are not permitted to be parked in driveways or on streets within the community between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. Please remedy this situation immediately to avoid further action. Sincerely, Margaret Thornfield, HOA President." I read the letter twice, then pulled out our HOA handbook and flipped to Section 1-B. There it was, buried in the middle of a paragraph about recreational vehicles, no commercial vehicles, including but not limited to pickup trucks, box trucks, or vehicles displaying commercial signage, shall be parked in driveways or on community streets between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. My F-150 wasn't even a commercial vehicle, was my personal truck, clean and well-maintained, without so much as a company decal on it. But apparently, in the eyes of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, all pickup trucks were commercial vehicles by default. I called the HOA office the next morning, hoping to clear up what I assumed was a misunderstanding. "Willowbrook Estates HOA. Is Denise speaking?" "Hi, Denise. This is Marcus Rodriguez from 47 Maple Drive. I received a notice about my truck being in violation of parking regulations, but I think there might be some confusion. My truck isn't a commercial vehicle, it's just my personal pickup." There was a pause, followed by the sound of papers shuffling. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm looking at your file now. According to our records, you own a Ford F-150. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's right." "Well, pickup trucks are classified as commercial vehicles under our community guidelines regardless of their use. The notice stands." I felt my jaw tighten. "But that doesn't make sense. Half the guys in my office drive pickup trucks as their personal vehicles. There's nothing commercial about mine." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Rodriguez, but the rules are clearly stated in the handbook. If you'd like to dispute this, you can file a formal appeal with the board. But until then, the vehicle needs to be moved to comply with parking regulations." "And where exactly am I supposed to park it? I live here. This is my home." "You could consider renting a storage unit, or perhaps parking on a public street outside the community boundaries." The nearest public street was a quarter-mile walk from my house through an area that wasn't particularly safe after dark. The suggestion was not only inconvenient, but borderline ridiculous. "Let me speak to Margaret Thornfield," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Mrs. Thornfield is quite busy, but I can schedule an appointment if you'd like. She has an opening next Thursday at 2 p.m. That was 8 days away. 8 days of either moving my truck every night or risking whatever further action the HOA had in mind. "Fine," I said. "Schedule the appointment." For the next week, I played their game. Every evening at 7:30, I would move my truck to a public parking space near the community entrance, then walk home in the fading light. Every morning at 6 a.m., I would make the same trek back to retrieve it. The routine was absurd, but I told myself it was temporary until I could sort things out with Mrs. Thornfield. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. The HOA office was located in a small building near the community center, designed to look like a miniature version of the houses in the neighborhood. I arrived promptly at 2 p.m., armed with printouts of truck classifications from the Department of Motor Vehicles and photos of my clearly non-commercial F-150. Margaret Thornfield was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in, a tight bun, and the kind of stern expression that suggested she'd never met a rule she didn't love. Her office was immaculate, with awards from various community organizations lining the walls and a large aerial photograph of Willowbrook Estates hanging behind her desk. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said without looking up from a stack of papers, "please, have a seat." I sat down in the leather chair across from her desk and placed my folder of documentation on my lap. "Mrs. Thornfield, thank you for seeing me. I think there's been a misunderstanding about my truck. I brought some information that might help clarify." She held up a hand to stop me. "Mr. Rodriguez, I've reviewed your case thoroughly. There's no misunderstanding. Your vehicle is a pickup truck, and pickup trucks are considered commercial vehicles under our community guidelines. The classification is quite clear. But according to the DMV, my truck is registered as a personal vehicle, not commercial." I opened my folder and pulled out the registration documents. "See here. There's no commercial designation anywhere on the paperwork." Mrs. Thornfield barely glanced at the documents. "The DMV's classification is irrelevant to our community standards. We have our own definitions, which are clearly outlined in the handbook that you signed when you purchased your home. Those definitions don't make sense, though. My neighbor 3 houses down has a Honda Ridgeline, which is also a pickup truck. Why isn't he getting notices? The Honda Ridgeline is classified as a sport utility truck, not a pickup truck. It falls under a different category in our guidelines." Stared at her, wondering if I'd somehow stumbled into an alternate reality where logic had ceased to exist. "Mrs. Thornfield, with all due respect, both vehicles serve the same purpose. They both have open beds, they're both used for personal transportation, and they're both parked in residential driveways. The only difference is the brand name. Mr. Rodriguez, I appreciate your passion on this matter, but the rules are the rules. They exist to maintain property values and preserve the aesthetic character of our community. Pickup trucks, particularly large ones like yours, create a certain impression that doesn't align with the upscale image we've worked hard to cultivate here in Willowbrook Estates." The mask was slipping now. This wasn't about commercial vehicles or community guidelines. This was about image and perception. Truck, despite being clean, well-maintained, and parked responsibly in my own driveway, somehow threatened the precious aesthetic of Willowbrook Estates. "So what you're really saying is that my truck looks too blue-collar for your neighborhood." Mrs. Thornfield's expression hardened. "I'm saying that we have standards, Mr. Rodriguez, standards that every resident agrees to uphold when they choose to live here. If you're unwilling to comply with our community guidelines, perhaps Willowbrook Estates isn't the right fit for you and your family." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. "Comply or consider moving." I left the meeting frustrated and angry, but determined not to let the HOA bully me out of my own home. Sarah would be back from Quantico in 10 days, and I knew she'd have some thoughts about this situation. In the meantime, I decided to do some research of my own. That evening, I spent hours combing through HOA law and community guidelines from similar neighborhoods. What I discovered was enlightening. While HOAs had broad authority to enforce community standards, those standards had to be applied consistently and reasonably. The selective enforcement of rules like allowing Honda Ridgelines while banning Ford F-150s could be grounds for challenging the HOA's actions. I also learned that Texas state law provided certain protections for homeowners against overly restrictive HOA rules. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, citing relevant statutes and requesting a review of their vehicle classification policy. 23 hours and 47 minutes after Sarah's ultimatum, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Riverside Towing, Mr. Rodriguez. This is Pete from Riverside Towing. I got authorization to release your vehicle, no charge. I felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with disbelief. No charge at all? That's what I was told. You can pick it up any time after 8 a.m. And, Mr. Rodriguez, I was also told to tell you that all storage fees will be refunded by check within 48 hours. After I hung up, Sarah emerged from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that could have powered half of Austin. Let me guess, she said. Mrs. Thornfield decided to be reasonable. Trucks ready for pickup, all fees refunded. I can't believe it actually worked. Marcus, that wasn't even the warm-up act. Mrs. Thornfield made a choice to handle this quietly, which shows she's smarter than I initially gave her credit for. But that doesn't mean our work here is done. Over the next few days, I began to understand what Sarah meant. The truck situation had been resolved, but it had also revealed something larger, a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond our family. Sarah had spent her evenings systematically documenting HOA violations, researching property records, and building what she called a comprehensive picture of institutional corruption. Look at this, she said one evening, spreading printouts. Across our dining room table, in the past 2 years, the HOA has initiated enforcement actions against 37 different properties. Want to guess what they all have in common? I studied the list of addresses. I don't see an obvious pattern. Look at the ownership records. Every single property targeted for enforcement is owned by young families, single parents, or minorities. Meanwhile, the established residents, particularly the ones with social connections to Mrs. Thornfield, have multiple violations that have never been addressed. She pointed to a highlighted section of one document. Mrs. Patterson on Oak Street has had an unauthorized garden shed for 3 years. No enforcement action. Mr. Williams on Elm Street installed a satellite dish without HOA approval 18 months ago. No enforcement action. But Mrs. Chen gets cited for having the wrong color mulch in her flower beds, and the Johnson family gets fined for their son's basketball hoop being visible from the street. The more I looked at the evidence Sarah had compiled, the more obvious the pattern became. This wasn't about maintaining community standards. It was about maintaining a certain demographic profile. This is systematic discrimination, I said. Exactly. And discrimination based on race, national origin, and familial status is a federal crime. When it's carried out under color of law, Mrs. Thornfield has been using her position as HOA president to create a hostile environment for residents who don't fit her personal vision of what the community should look like. Sarah had been busy in other ways too. She'd started attending HOA board meetings, which were supposedly open to all residents, but had previously been sparsely attended. Her presence had an immediate effect on the dynamics of the meetings. Should have seen it, she told me after the first meeting she attended. Mrs. Thornfield was clearly rattled. She kept stumbling over her words, and she couldn't maintain eye contact with me for more than a few seconds at a time. What did you do? I took notes, lots of notes, and I asked questions, lots of questions. Every time they made a decision, I asked about the legal basis. Every time they referenced a policy, I asked to see the documentation. Every time they claimed something was standard procedure, I asked for examples of how that procedure had been applied consistently across the community. The effect was immediate and dramatic. At the next meeting, 3 other residents showed up, families who had been quietly dealing with their own HOA harassment but had been too intimidated to speak up. By the 3rd meeting, the small community center room was packed with residents who had stories to tell about selective enforcement, arbitrary fines, and harassment campaigns. Sarah had become the unofficial leader of what she jokingly called the resistance. But there was nothing funny about the evidence they were collecting. Property owners were coming forward with documented patterns of discrimination, selective enforcement, and abuse of power that stretched back years. We need to do something with all this information, said Maria Santos, a single mother who had been fined repeatedly for minor infractions while her neighbor's identical violations went unnoticed. Mrs. Thornfield has been terrorizing people for too long. I've been thinking about that, Sarah replied. There are several options. We could file a civil rights complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We could pursue a class action lawsuit against the HOA, or we could take a more direct approach. What kind of direct approach? Asked David Chen, whose family had been cited for the mulch violation. Sarah smiled in a way that had become familiar to me over the past few weeks, the smile of someone who was about to deliver very bad news to very deserving people. We could call for a special election to remove Mrs. Thornfield from the HOA board and replace the entire leadership structure. The room went quiet. In the small world of Willowbrook Estates, this would be the equivalent of a revolution. Can we do that? Maria asked. According to the HOA bylaws, any group of residents representing at least 30% of the properties can call for a special election. Based on the attendance at these meetings and the number of families who have been affected by discriminatory enforcement, I think we have the numbers. But what if we lose? Sarah's expression grew serious. Then we pursue federal charges. But I don't think we're going to lose. Mrs. Thornfield's power depends on residents. Being too intimidated or too isolated to fight back, once people realize they're not alone, once they see that her authority isn't absolute, everything changes. The planning for the special election took 3 weeks. Sarah organized volunteers to canvass the neighborhood, document violations, and educate residents about their rights under both HOA law and federal civil rights statutes. What she discovered was that Mrs. Thornfield's reign of terror had been far more extensive than anyone had realized. The Walsh family had been forced to remove a playground set from their backyard because it was too visible from the street, while the Hendersons had an identical playground that had never been questioned. The Patels had been cited for having too many cars in their driveway when their extended family visited for holidays, while other families regularly hosted parties with dozens of vehicles and faced no consequences. Most disturbing was the case of elderly Mrs. Rodriguez, no relation to us, whose grandson had been cited for visiting too frequently and parking his car in her driveway. The harassment had escalated to the point where Mrs. Rodriguez had stopped having family visits rather than face constant fines and threatening letters. This isn't just discrimination, Sarah said after interviewing Mrs. Rodriguez. This is elder abuse. Mrs. Thornfield has been systematically isolating vulnerable residents and using her authority to deprive them of family relationships. As word of the special election spread through the community, the response was swift and polarized. Longtime residents who had been part of Mrs. Thornfield's inner circle began a counter-campaign, arguing that the HOA's strict enforcement was necessary to maintain property values and community standards. The battle lines were drawn clearly. On one side were the families who had been targeted for harassment, along with newer residents who supported fair and consistent enforcement of community rules. On the other side were the established residents, who had benefited from selective enforcement, and who saw the challenge to Mrs. Thornfield as a threat to their privileged position. Mrs. Thornfield herself had become increasingly desperate and erratic. She began sending out newsletters filled with inflammatory language about outside agitators and radical elements trying to destroy the community. She organized her own meetings held in her home, where she warned supporters that the special election was part of a larger conspiracy to lower property values and attract undesirable elements to the neighborhood. She's making this personal, Sarah observed after receiving a particularly nasty letter that questioned her true motives for moving to Willowbrook Estates. That's good. When people start making emotional decisions instead of rational ones, they make mistakes. The mistake came 2 weeks before the special election when Mrs. Thornfield overplayed her hand in spectacular fashion. It started with a late-night phone call from Maria Santos. "Sarah, you need to come over here right now. Mrs. Thornfield just tried to have my car towed from my own driveway." When we arrived at Maria's house, we found a tow truck hooked up to her Honda Civic, with Mrs. Thornfield standing on the sidewalk directing the operation. The driver looked uncomfortable, but he was following orders. "What's the violation?" Sarah asked, approaching the group with her phone already recording. Mrs. Thornfield spun around, her face flushed with anger. "The vehicle is parked illegally in the driveway. It's blocking the sidewalk." I looked at the car's position. The front bumper was at least 3 feet from the sidewalk, in exactly the same position as dozens of other cars throughout the neighborhood. "Pete," Sarah said to the tow truck driver, Is this the same vehicle position that you've been authorized to tow from other properties in TH? 6 months after Sarah's election as HOA president, I thought our story was over. The community had been transformed. Mrs. Thornfield had retreated into bitter isolation, and life in Willowbrook Estates had settled into a peaceful rhythm of fair enforcement and genuine community spirit. Sarah had even started talking about running for city council, inspired by how much positive change was possible when good people stepped up to serve. Then Detective Ray Morrison from the Austin Police Department called Sarah's office on a Tuesday morning in March. Agent Rodriguez, this is Detective Morrison, APD. We met during that HOA incident last year. I was hoping we could talk about Margaret Thornfield. Sarah put the call on speaker so I could hear. What about Mrs. Thornfield? Well, we've been investigating some financial irregularities related to several HOA accounts across the city, and her name keeps coming up. But it's bigger than just HOA fraud. Much bigger. An hour later, Detective Morrison was sitting in our living room with a file folder that was easily 3 inches thick. Here's what we know, he said, spreading documents across our coffee table. Margaret Thornfield has been running the same scam in multiple communities across Texas for the past 8 years. She gets elected to HOA boards, establishes herself as the power broker, then systematically embezzles community funds while using discriminatory enforcement to drive out residents who might ask too many questions. Sarah leaned forward, her FBI training kicking in. How much money are we talking about? Conservatively, about $2.3 million across 14 different communities. But that's just what we can prove so far. I stared at the documents. $2.3 million. From HOA fees, it's more sophisticated than simple embezzlement, Morrison explained. She creates shell companies that provide community services, landscaping, security, maintenance. The HOAs pay inflated rates to these companies, and the money gets funneled back to accounts she controls. Meanwhile, she uses her position to target and harass residents who might be likely to scrutinize the finances. Young families, minorities, new residents, Sarah said grimly. People who don't have established social networks in the community. Exactly, and here's the really disturbing part. She's been coordinating with other HOA board members to share information about problematic residents. There's an actual network of corrupt HOA officials who help each other maintain control and cover up financial irregularities. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Detective Morrison, this sounds like it goes beyond local jurisdiction. If there's interstate coordination and mail fraud involved, this becomes a federal case. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. The Austin PD doesn't have the resources to investigate something this complex, but if the FBI took the lead, I'll need to recuse myself from anything directly related to Willowbrook Estates, but I can refer this to the appropriate federal task force. Sarah paused, studying the documents. How did you discover all this? Morrison smiled grimly. Funny thing about that, after Mrs. Thornfield was removed from your HOA board, she moved to a community called Heritage Hills, about 30 miles south of here. Within 3 months, she was elected to their HOA board. Within 6 months, they were having the exact same problems you had. Discriminatory enforcement, harassment campaigns, mysterious increases in community fees. But this time, the residents knew what to look for, I said, beginning to understand. This time, they had heard about what happened. In Willowbrook Estates, a resident named Carlos Mendoza called your HOA office, asking for advice about fighting back against HOA abuse. That call eventually made its way to me, and when I started investigating Heritage Hills, I found the same patterns we'd seen here. That led me to start looking at Mrs. Thornfield's history more broadly. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, her mind clearly working through the implications. Detective, I need you to understand something. If we're talking about a coordinated conspiracy involving multiple HOA boards across state lines, using mail fraud and civil rights violations to facilitate embezzlement, we're looking at federal charges that could put people in prison for decades. I understand, and I think that's exactly what needs to happen. That afternoon, Sarah drove to the FBI field office in Austin. By evening, she had briefed a federal task force on organized fraud and civil rights violations. Within a week, federal agents were executing search warrants across 3 states, seizing records from dozens of HOA offices and shell companies. The investigation that followed was massive and complex, but the evidence was overwhelming. Margaret Thornfield hadn't just been a petty tyrant. Drunk on small-time power, she had been the central figure in a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had stolen millions of dollars from homeowners while systematically violating their civil rights. The network she had built was extensive and disturbing. HOA board members in communities across Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico had been sharing information about residents who asked too many questions about finances or challenged discriminatory enforcement. They had coordinated their harassment campaigns, shared strategies for intimidation, and helped each other cover up financial irregularities. Most shocking was the discovery that several property management companies and towing services had been active participants in the conspiracy, inflating bills and sharing kickbacks with corrupt board members. It's like a mafia. To me, after one particularly long day of testimony preparation, they created a system where they could steal money and abuse residents with impunity, because anyone who tried to fight back would be systematically harassed until they either gave up or moved away. The federal indictments, when they came, were sweeping. Margaret Thornfield was charged with racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and money laundering. 14 other individuals were charged with related crimes, including several HOA board members, property management executives, and the owner of Riverside Towing. But the most surprising development came when FBI forensic accountants discovered where much of the stolen money had gone. "You're not going to believe this," Sarah said, coming home from work with an expression I couldn't quite read, part amazement, part disgust, part something else entirely. "What did you find?" Mrs. Thornfield used the stolen HOA money to buy investment properties, rental houses, small apartment buildings, even some commercial properties. But here's the kicker: she's been using those properties to house undocumented immigrants in substandard conditions, charging them inflated rent and threatening to call immigration enforcement if they complained about the living conditions. I stared at her. So she was stealing money from homeowners to fund a slumlord operation that exploited vulnerable immigrants. It gets worse. She was also using her connections in various HOAs to identify communities with large immigrant populations, then targeting them for harassment and discriminatory enforcement. The goal was to drive property values down so she could buy more investment properties cheaply. The hypocrisy was staggering. Margaret Thornfield had spent years using coded language about community standards and undesirable elements, while simultaneously profiting from the exploitation of the very people she claimed to want to keep out of good neighborhoods. Trial, when it finally began 18 months later, was a media sensation. Local news crews covered every day of testimony, and the story went national when civil rights organizations highlighted the case as an example of systemic discrimination, hidden behind the facade of community governance. Sarah testified for 3 days, detailing the patterns of discriminatory enforcement and the systematic harassment of residents who challenged the HOA's authority. Her testimony was calm, professional, and devastating to the defense's claims that the charges were the result of a misunderstanding about community standards. The most dramatic moment came when Carlos Mendoza, the Heritage Hills resident who had first called our HOA for advice, testified about Mrs. Thornfield's attempts to drive his family out of their community. "She told me that people like my family were the reason property values were declining," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "She said that if we couldn't afford to maintain our property to community standards, maybe we should find somewhere more appropriate to live. But when I tried to get specifics about what standards we were violating, I couldn't get straight answers. Everything was subjective. Everything was up to her interpretation." The defense's strategy was to portray Mrs. Thornfield as an overzealous community volunteer who had made mistakes but hadn't committed crimes. They argued that HOA enforcement was inherently subjective and that any disparities in treatment were the result of individual circumstances rather than systematic discrimination. The prosecution's response was to present evidence of the coordination and planning behind the discrimination. They showed emails where Mrs. Thornfield and other board members had explicitly discussed strategies for targeting problematic residents. They presented financial records showing how enforcement actions were timed to maximize the impact on specific families. Most damning, they played recorded phone calls where Mrs. Thornfield had discussed her plans to clean up neighborhoods. By making life difficult for residents who didn't,